Hello, my dears, and welcome to, a very special episode of Strange Playground. Special in the sense that the subject matter it's something I've been following since it was announced, since it was conceived, and I have followed it with bated breath, waiting to see if it can capitalize on its own promise, if it could be what I sincerely hoped it would be. And my God, having watched it all the way through now, yeah, it does it for me. I think that this particular piece of work has captured everything it promised to, and then some. I am talking, of course, about the recent Netflix series Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance, The Dark Crystal. Now, I am one of those children. I am one of those children that was born in the 1980s, so was raised with these very peculiar fantasy films that just sort of came out of nowhere. There was this really strange penchant in the 1980s and through the 1990s, actually, for fantasy films, even though fantasy wasn't really that significant at the time, certainly nowhere near as significant as it has been in recent decades, to just crop up out of nowhere. They weren't part of any tradition, they weren't part of any trend or anything like that. They just happened. They came out of nowhere. Things like Krull, for example. Anyone remember Krull? Weird piece of work. Quite good, actually. Bizarre, camp as all hell, but really good. Things like the wonderful this is the Dark Crystal sister film in many respects. Things like Labyrinth, Labyrinth probably being the one that most people remember the most, probably because of David Bowie, and also because it is just such a good film. It's such a brilliant film. The Dark Crystal is generally regarded as its lesser sister, and that's kind of sad to me. It's not the kind of fantasy that I respond to as strongly as I do Labyrinth. The difference between the two of them, because there is fantasy and then fantasy, it's such a broad term. Fantasy. It includes so much, but I tend to err more on the side of the magic realist fantasy that you find in Labyrinth, where everything seems to be an expression of something psychological happening for one of the characters. In this instance, the Labyrinth, the Goblin King, all of the fantastical elements are metaphorically reflective of what's happening in the protagonist Sarah's head, because she's going through puberty. That's basically it. She's going through a growing up process where everything is frustration, not knowing where she is. It's sexual frustration. It's lack of identity, and I love that. I love that stuff to bits. The sort of Angela Carter style fantasy, the magic realism stuff. I adore that to the nth degree. And given the choice, I'll always err for that over the kind of fantasy that you find in The Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal is more Tolkien-esque. It's more that sort of high mythological fantasy. But what I've always found distinct about The Dark Crystal, the original film, is the way it tells its story. It's really unusual. Most of the story at the beginning of the Dark Crystal film has already happened. All of the significant events, the histories, the genocides, the wars, the grand mythological apocalypses have already happened when you start the film. And what you're drawn into is this dying, decaying world. It reminds me a little bit, looking back on it bizarrely, it reminds me a little bit of Dark Souls, actually. It's got that quality about it. It's the original Dark Crystal film, apart from being a technical marvel, which it absolutely is. It's an absolute technical marvel because everything is puppetry. Absolutely everything in the original Dark Crystal is practical effects and puppetry, and that makes it so interesting. It makes it, just on a purely, as a technical exercise, it is absolutely wonderful. As an aesthetic exercise in terms of design, it is out of this world. It is something so unusual, so distinct. The world that's created, which we now know is called Thra, but which I don't think is ever named in the original film, is its own ecology. It's its own world that runs on its own metaphysics and its own rules, its own nature. It is so interesting. It's so interesting to explore. But of course, in the Dark Crystal film, almost everything is only referred to because it's all already happened. Everything is grinding down. Everything is reaching this apex point where it's either going to rejuvenate itself or it's going to collapse entirely. Those are the two choices in the Dark Crystal film. Another thing that makes it distinct is how bloody dark it is. There are certain images in the Dark Crystal that are really disturbing and really strange. The Skeksis and their castle and their machines and their monsters, what they do to the Gelflings and to the creatures that they drain of their vital essence to stay young, is phenomenally disturbing. The whole situation is phenomenally disturbing. The Skeksis themselves, the Skeksis have always been my personal favourite Jim Henson creations because that not only are they beautiful, they are this wonderful mix of influences. There's something slightly demonic about them, that sort of vulture reptilian form that they have going on, but also in terms of their clothing, which has fantastical elements but also pseudo-historical leaning. So they look slightly Elizabethan, like courtiers in Elizabethan times. They have that quality about them too, where everything is gaudy. They have a slight foppishness to them, where everything is overly theatrical and decadent and baroque and absolutely beautiful because of its excess. I love that as a notion of evil. Evil as excess, which encapsulates the Skeksis completely. That is the core of their malevolence. They are decadent. They want more of everything. Absolutely everything, including life. Even if it's at the expense of every living creature on Thra and Thra itself. They are actually destroying the metaphysics or unbalancing the metaphysics of this world by draining their victims of vital essence, because that essence, that experience, that soul stuff, I suppose, is supposed to return to Thra and be reborn somewhere else. That's the metaphysics of this world. But they're stopping it. They're like vampires in that regard. Or leeches or ticks. There's something very parasitic about the Skeksis. But I've always responded to them aesthetically more than anything. They're so interesting. Of course, you find out in the Dark Crystal that the reason they are the way they are is because they are elemental evil. They are the negative sides of another being. A being that was once more complex in its entirety, but that was split into two by some metaphysical cataclysm. So you have the original entities, the Urskeks, who were semi-divine by all accounts. They're actually semi-divine extra-dimensional entities, were split in two. And they became the Mystics, who were all the positive elements, and the Skeksis, who are all of the negative elements. So the Skeksis are rapine and cruel and sadistic and petulant and greedy and everything you can imagine. They are the embodiments of raw negativity. That's what they are, and that's why they act the way they do. It's almost impossible for them to act otherwise because that's what they are at base level, and I find that fascinating. I find that at that degree of evil, I find to be fascinating, where it's innate, it's inbred. I love that. Elemental negativity. They're also just very interesting characters. The way they are puppeteered in the original film gives them this incredible range of emotion and posture, whereby for all the world they look like living beings, they very rarely look like puppets. They look like living creatures. And I was fascinated by that as a child, and I'm fascinated by that now. What the prequel series has done is it has taken the elements that were suggested in the Dark Crystal, and it has just extenuated them wildly. So it is grafted on detail upon detail upon detail. It has taken the core of this world, the suggestions of mythology, and it has elaborated them in all the best ways. It has done things with the world and with the Skeksis themselves, with the political dynamics of this world before it all goes to hell, and made it interesting and complex and wonderful. I particularly loved the conceit of the Skeksis having basically pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. They have basically elevated themselves to the levels of gods or prophets or saints. Everyone in all the world, in all of Thra, believes them to be these incredibly smart, wise, kind sages, including the Gelfling, who are these entities, these slightly elfin creatures who are basically the true children of Thra. They're bound to the world on an elemental level. Even they have been convinced that these creatures that run roughshod over them and that treat them very badly actually are their saviours and their prophets and their fathers and their loved ones. I love that dynamic, to the point whereby in the series there are Gelfling that will not accept it. No matter what they see, no matter how far the Skeksis go, they will not accept, right up until the very breaking point that the Skeksis are bad news, that they are abusive, essentially. I love that. I loved that. It lent this layer of complexity to things, and also this wonderful layer of postmodern resonance. So, I mean, stop me if this sounds familiar. What you have in the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance is a corrupt ruling class presiding over a sort of middle class, which is comprised of the parents of the parent generations of the Gelfling, and those parent generations are far too comfortable. They're far too comfortable with the influence, the prestige, the sense of comfort and safety that the Skeksis have provided. So they won't listen. They won't do anything. When the younger generations, who are more rebellious, less comfortable, more curious, more incisive, actually start to ask questions. Why do we need to do this? Why do the Skeksis need this? Why should we do this for the Skeksis when they've done fuck all for us? That is treated quite literally as blasphemy in some instances. You have a younger generation who are dissatisfied, asking questions of the power structure and the structure of privilege that exists here, and threatening to corrode it. Does that not sound familiar? And also, on top of that, you have this status quo of corruption and of comfort and of privilege threatening to destroy this entire world. Again, sounds somewhat familiar, doesn't it? It's a very good example of how fantasy can be used to reflect and explore things within reality. People have this awful, myopic, and ridiculously simplistic preconception of what fantasy is, whereby they regard it as exclusively escapist. Now, I have issues with that term. There's no such thing as escapist fiction. I'm really sorry. I know it's very common and very popular to assume otherwise, but it's just not possible. There is no such thing. It doesn't matter how far removed from reality you create your world or your work of art or your fiction. It will always reflect back at you something that you, maybe subconsciously, maybe not even entirely aware, are trying to explore about yourself, about the state that you find yourself in, about the world. You cannot deny metaphor or allegory. It's going to happen naturally regardless, because it is part of the essential anatomy of fiction, of creativity. That's what it's there for. You can't remove yourself from it. Even in something like Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, which is set in an entirely fantastical world with entirely fantastical creatures and races and species, what they embody metaphorically is something that is happening in us, something that's happening in the world, and it very clearly does. What this is an examination and an expression of the current political status quo and the cultural status quo through fantastical imagery. But what I really appreciate about it, despite this undercurrent of darkness, and it is really dark, it's particularly dark if you're a fan of the original film, because you know there's a genocide coming. You know that these Gelfling that you're following, and there's quite a lot of them, and you get very attached to them, are all going to die. You know that they're all going to die, because at the beginning of the Dark Crystal film, the Gelfling are extinct, barring 2 of them. They are extinct. So you know they're going to die. So that lends things a certain undercurrent of darkness. But beyond that, there is this genuine sense of hope in this. There is a genuine sense that things can be better, things can be solved, things can be healed and made whole again, even for the Skeksis. Even for the Skeksis. They are not just monsters to be overthrown and murdered. They are victims too. Let's not forget that. The Skeksis are victims too. They're acting according to their natures because of what they are, because of the event that broke the crystal and that shattered them into the mystics and the Skeksis. They have to be healed again. They have to be made one again for the world to be healed. It's about, there is a certain holistic quality going on here, and I loved it. I loved every second of it, no matter how dark it gets, and it does get pretty bloody dark at times. There is always this sense of hope here, of looking forward, of driving to solve things rather than allowing the darkness and the desperation to get to you. And I loved that. I loved it. Every moment is celebratory. The show loves what it's doing. The people who created this show clearly loved what they're doing. They loved what they're doing on a world building level. So they want you to see this world. They want you to see how it works culturally, politically, ecologically, metaphysically. They want you to know how it's organized and structured, and they want to express that to you in the most visual, brilliant way imaginable. They want you. It's celebratory on the level of its aesthetics. This world is so beautiful. Thra is so beautifully realized, the way it works, the way its ecosystems function. Everywhere you look, you'll see little puppet creatures with little puppet flowers and weeds, and they'll be interacting with one another, and some greater creature will come out and it will eat some of the smaller creatures and then burrow away. It is an amazing exercise in world building. But it's also the characters. The people who created this series, they desperately wanted to capture the essence of the original film, but also to do something new, to move it forward. And the characters are just delightful. From the most base to the most ascended, they are absolutely delightful. They're so distinct. They're so characterized, not only by the way they look and the way they sound, but the way they move. They've got real physicality. If you look at the way the Chamberlain Skeksis, for example, the way he slinks around and is always bowed-headed, so he's lower than the other Skeksis, so he's presenting less of a threat to them. You know, he's always submissive, or at least presenting a facade of submission. Love that. The way the general is always reared up and is always with his chest puffed out, you know? That kind of thing. It is so, so clever. And some of the new additions that they brought here, 2 of my favourite characters were the 2 new Skeksis, the Hunter, who is an amazing creature, and the Heretic. The Heretic was probably my favourite character in the entire thing, I've got to say. The Skeksis that has denied his own nature, and that has abandoned his brothers and is now seeking to heal himself and them all, the entire world. I loved that. I loved it. This show is so positive. It's so celebratory in so many ways, aesthetically, musically, narratively. It is beautiful. The one character who I just can't get enough of, Ogra. She was always my favourite in the original film. She's my favourite in this too, and I imagine she'll be a lot of people's favourites. She is wonderful. They had so much fun animating and playing this character. She is the driving force. She is the one that is sort of manipulating events to where they need to be. She's kind of the Gandalf character in this one. And normally, I don't like the Gandalf characters. She's the Doctor, essentially, you know? She's that character who comes in and manipulates people to their own benefit. But I actually really liked Ogra, because she is... whatever she's doing, whatever she's foreseen, it's the way things have to be. There is no other option. She has seen through Thra itself where the future goes, and there's only one chance. There's only one chance to get things right. And sadly, that does lead to some very negative consequences down the way. There is only one chance. And that's really sad. It makes Ogra herself a really sad, sorrowful character, because she kind of knows. She kind of knows that this has to happen, that the genocides to come are going to happen regardless. And it's really sad. It's really sad knowing that. There's a sequence in which she communes with Thra and with the spirit of the world and with the Gelfling as they are spiritually communing with one another. And the puppet is dancing and capering about, and there's music. It is wonderful. It is absolutely wonderful. All I can really express about this show is how celebratory it is. It's how positive. It's how sincere it is. This is another thing I love about this. It is a fantasy story that is not littered with fucking postmodern references and in-jokes and references to present-day real-world things. That is something I adore, because, quite frankly, that's been almost impossible since Disney's Aladdin made it so profitable way back in the 1990s. It's been almost impossible. I hope that this project is so spectacularly successful that it inspires not only more seasons, which of course will happen now, but any number of others. And I hope they are as sincere and as respectful, as joyous and as inspiring as this. I've got to say, it was beautiful. It touched my heart. It absolutely aroused so much positive emotion watching this series. It's why I love stories. It's why I love stories. It's why I love fantasy. It's why I love abstruse, strange, bizarre, imaginative, dreamlike material. I thought it was a wonder. An absolute wonder, far and beyond the amazing technical achievement it is, because I can't imagine what it was like filming this bloody thing. I can't even begin to imagine. I can only say, I can only offer the creators of this my sincerest, heartfelt thanks for making it, and making it with such fidelity, with such sincerity, with such joyousness, and for doing it so well. What else can I say? It's a highlight for me, and I'll be rewatching it again, and probably again, to be honest, because I loved it. I loved every second of it, and I hope that you guys do too. So, until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!